My sister looked me dead in the eyes at our family's 25th anniversary dinner and said, "You are always the slow one. You know that, right? The one we had to carry." She didn't whisper it. She said it at the table, with the breadsticks still warm in the basket and my parents sitting right there. My dad looked down at his plate. My mom reached over and touched my sister's arm, not to stop her, just a light tap, like she was agreeing but didn't want to say so herself. I was 31 years old. I had a mortgage, a job I'd worked myself half to death for, and a sister who still talked to me like I was the kid who failed third-grade spelling bees. I drove home that night with the radio off. I remember the highway was empty and the sky had that flat gray color it gets in February, like the world forgot to finish itself. I thought about what I would have said if I'd been braver. I thought about all the things I'd swallowed over the years to keep the peace. Then I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for 20 minutes until I felt nothing, because nothing was easier to carry than what I actually felt. That dinner was 3 months before everything changed, before I found out what my sister had been doing, before the night at the hotel ballroom when a man I'd never met in my life walked up to me and handed me an envelope that rearranged everything I thought I knew about my own family. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Fiona. I'm 32 now. I work in operations for a mid-sized logistics company outside of Columbus, Ohio. Or I did until recently. My sister Lee is 4 years older than me and has always been the daughter my parents pointed to when someone asked how they were doing. Lee graduated top of her class at Ohio State. Lee married well. Lee had the house in Dublin with the big porch and the 2 kids who did travel soccer. Lee was the proof that our parents had done something right. I was the other one. Not failing, exactly. Never quite failing. But never the story they led with at Christmas, never the one who got the calls just to chat. I was the one they called when Lee needed something, and I was the most convenient person to ask. Could I pick up the kids from school on Tuesday? Could I help move some furniture? Could I cover for Lee at our grandmother Vera's birthday because Lee had a conflict and Vera always loved me anyway? I covered for Lee a lot. Our grandmother Vera, my dad's mom, was the one person in the family who treated me like I was worth something on my own terms. She lived alone in a ranch house in Gala, drove herself to the grocery store until she was 81, and had opinions about everything. She thought Lee was too soft underneath all the shine. She told me that once sitting at her kitchen table while I helped her repot a plant. "Your sister needs everyone to see her," she said. "You just need to do the work. That's the better gift, baby." Vera died 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. 12 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. I was there every week. I drove out after work on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I sat with her when the pain was bad, and I held her hand when she wanted to talk, and I stayed quiet when she didn't. Lee came twice. Once for a Sunday visit when the whole family was there, and once for the last week when it was clear there wasn't much time left. I don't say that to be cruel about Lee. I say it because it matters later. When Vera died, we found out she'd had a will drafted about 6 months before her diagnosis. The estate wasn't enormous. Her house, some savings, a few investments she'd made carefully over 50 years. But it wasn't nothing either. The total came out to just over $400,000. My dad was her only child, so most of it passed to him and my mom. But there was a specific bequest listed in the will, $60,000 to me, with a note that simply said, "For Fiona, who always showed up." Lee was livid. She didn't say it at the funeral. She waited until we were back at my parents' house, plates of casserole sitting half-eaten on the counter, and then she said, "Mom, did you know Grandma had that written in there?" Her voice was perfectly controlled, which was how I knew she was furious. Lay only got quiet when she was actually angry. The loud version was just performance. My mom said she hadn't known. My dad said Vera never told him. Lee looked at me across the kitchen with an expression I can only describe as assessment, like she was calculating something. She didn't bring it up again, not directly, but after that day, something shifted. She started being nicer to me in a way that felt like a project. Invited me to things, asked about my job, texted me articles she thought I'd like, and I let myself believe it because I wanted a sister. I'd always wanted a sister. I just wanted the one I thought I might have. The logistics company I work for is called Mid-State Supply Partners. We coordinate freight movement for manufacturing clients across the Midwest. Not glamorous, but the kind of work that matters when it's done right and falls apart spectacularly when it isn't. I'd been there for 6 years, started as a shipping coordinator, worked my way up to regional operations manager. I had 12 people on my team. I knew every client account we ran, knew the margin on every major contract, knew exactly which relationships kept the lights on and which ones we were one bad quarter away from losing. The most important client we had was a distribution network called Hargrove Industrial. They'd been with us for 4 years. Their account represented about 28% of our annual revenue. The kind of number that makes executives go quiet in meetings when someone says it out loud. They had a regional director named Walter Chu, who I'd built a real working relationship with over 3 years. Not a friendship exactly, but the kind of professional trust that takes a long time to build and only works if both people are actually straight with each other. When Hargrove had a problem, a shipment delay, a routing error, a billing discrepancy, Walter called me. Not my director. Not the VP of Client Services. Me, I'd made sure I was the person worth calling. Last spring, Hargrove started having issues with their Eastern Corridor shipments. 3 weeks of delays that were partly our fault, partly a carrier problem, partly weather. The kind of compounding mess that doesn't have a clean villain but still needs someone to fix it. I worked 18-hour days for 2 weeks straight. I rerouted freight through alternative carriers, negotiated emergency rate agreements, personally called Walter every morning with a status update before he'd even had coffee. We saved the account. Walter told me afterward that he'd been close to recommending they go to bid, and that I was the reason he didn't. My director, a man named Gary who played a lot of golf and was very concerned about his own optics, wrote a company-wide email praising the operations team for the recovery. He did not mention my name. He mentioned his own role in overseeing the response twice. I was annoyed. I moved on. That's what you do. What I didn't know was that Gary had also been telling the company's executive team that the Hargrove relationship was primarily his, that he was the key contact, that his leadership had stabilized the account. I found this out much later, in the worst possible way. The company anniversary gala was my CEO's idea. 30 years in business, she wanted to mark it with something real. Not a cocktail hour, but a full evening. Ballroom at the Hilton downtown, actual dinner, remarks from long-term clients, a few awards for employees. She'd asked Gary to help coordinate the client outreach, which meant Gary had sent the invitations. Leigh had recently taken a position on the board of a local business development nonprofit that Gary was also involved with. I didn't know that connection existed. I should have, maybe. But I was busy working and Leigh was busy doing the things Leigh did to collect access to important rooms. 3 weeks before the gala, Leigh called me. She said she'd heard about the event through a mutual contact and asked if she could come as my +1. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was my sister, and I still believed we were building something. The week before the gala, Leigh called again. Her voice had that controlled quality again. She said she'd been talking to some people, and she thought it might be a good time for me to simplify my professional commitments. She said she thought I was spread too thin. She said she had a friend who was looking for someone to help run the administrative side of a small startup. Much lower stress, probably fewer hours. It would be better for you, she said. I told her I wasn't interested. There was a pause. Then she said, "Just think about it, Fiona. Sometimes we stay in places out of habit, not because it's actually right for us." I didn't understand what she was really saying. Not yet. The night of the gala, I wore the black dress I'd had for 4 years because it still fit and it was still right, and I didn't have the energy to shop for something new. The ballroom was nicer than I expected. Round tables with white linens, a string quartet playing near the entrance, real centerpieces, the kind of event that costs more than it should and looks like exactly what it costs. I found my seat. Lee arrived 20 minutes later in a red dress that cost more than my car payment and immediately started working the room in a way that made me tired just watching. She knew more people there than I expected. She laughed at the right times and touched arms at the right times and excused herself at the right times to move to the next conversation. Gary gave remarks early in the evening. He talked about the company's growth, about key partnerships, about the importance of strong leadership. He mentioned the Hargrove account twice, and both times described it as a relationship he'd personally cultivated. I stared at my water glass and breathed through it. Our CEO, a woman named Janet, gave the second set of remarks. She was direct and funny and didn't seem to enjoy the sound of her own voice as much as Gary did. She talked about what it actually took to keep a logistics company running, the unglamorous details, the 6 a.m. phone calls, the people who fixed problems before clients knew there was a problem. She looked around the room while she talked. At one point, for just a second, she looked directly at me. I thought I imagined it. Then came the part I hadn't known was coming. Gary approached my table between courses and crouched down to my level in a way that was meant to seem friendly and felt immediately wrong. He said the evening included some housekeeping items for key stakeholders. He said there was some paperwork being circulated, restructuring related, consolidation of certain client account responsibilities, updating authorized contacts on file with clients. He set a folder in front of me. He said, "Nothing complicated, just formalizing some of the structural changes we've been planning." I looked at the folder. "Can I take this home to review?" I said. He said it would be better to handle it tonight. There was a notary present. It was really just routine. I looked at Lee across the table. She was talking to someone or seemed to be, but her eyes slid over to me for exactly 1 second. I looked back at the folder and did not open it. "I'd like to have my own attorney look at it first," I said. "I'll get it back to you this week." Gary's smile held, but something behind it went flat. He said that was fine, of course. Totally fine, and he took the folder and left. I watched him go and felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I excused myself to the restroom and stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists and tried to think clearly. What had just happened? What had I almost signed without reading? I didn't know. I just knew that Lee's eyes on me for that 1 second had told me something I couldn't name yet. When I came back to the table, a man was standing near my chair. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that was good quality and completely understated. I'd never seen him in my life. He introduced himself as Raymond Stokes. He said he was the legal counsel for Hargrove Industrial. He said he'd been hoping to speak with me this evening. He handed me an envelope. He said, "I think you should read this before you sign anything tonight." I opened the envelope in the hallway outside the ballroom, under the kind of fluorescent light that makes everyone look slightly unwell. Inside was a letter on Hargrove Industrial letterhead. It was addressed to Janet, our CEO. It was dated 4 days earlier. It was signed by Hargrove's president and 3 members of their executive team. It said that Hargrove had recently conducted a routine audit of vendor relationships. It said that in the course of that audit, they had reviewed their communication records and documented the operational history of their account with mid-state supply partners. It said that based on that review, they were writing to formally state for the record that the continuity of their business relationship was directly tied to the involvement of their primary operations contact. That would be me. It said that any restructuring that removed me from the account would trigger a review of the contract. It said they considered the relationship with me personally to be a material factor in the contract renewal coming up in the fall. There was a second document behind the letter. It was a summary Raymond had prepared, a timeline of communications, documented decisions, service recovery efforts. My name was in it over and over and over again. Gary's name was barely there. My hands were shaking. I stood in that hallway for a long time. I went back into the ballroom. Janet was making her way between tables, doing the rounds. When she got to mine, she held out her hand to shake mine and said, "Fiona, I was hoping to find you tonight." She said she'd received Hargrove's letter. She said it was the most direct piece of client advocacy for an individual employee she'd seen in 30 years of running the company. She said there were some conversations she wanted to have with me starting Monday morning. I said I'd be there. Lee appeared at my elbow about 10 minutes later. She said, "What was in the envelope?" I looked at her for a moment. I thought about all the casseroles I'd brought to Vera's kitchen. I thought about the February highway with the radio off. I thought about the folder Gary had placed in front of me like it was nothing. "Nothing you need to worry about," I said. "Just work stuff." Her expression flickered. She wanted to ask more but couldn't without revealing that she already knew more than she should. That was the moment I understood the whole thing. Later that week, I went to the county recorder's office and pulled the documents Gary had wanted me to sign. A contact there helped me understand what I was looking at. It was a reassignment of account stewardship. It would have removed me as the primary authorized contact on the Hargrove account and placed Gary there instead, retroactively, on paper. It also included a non-disparagement clause and a waiver of certain credit claims. If I'd signed it, I would have handed Gary the documented relationship with our most important client and legally restricted my ability to contest it. I found out through a friend who knew someone at Gary's golf club that Lee had met Gary at a nonprofit board meeting 2 months earlier. That she'd told him she had a sister at Mid-State who she thought would be willing to sign anything that was presented to her professionally, without asking too many questions. That she'd told him she could help make that happen. Lee told him that. About me. Her sister. The $60,000 from Vera's estate had been sitting in a savings account. I hadn't touched it. I'm not sure why. I think some part of me felt like spending it would mean she was more gone than she already was. I looked at it differently after that night. I thought about what Vera had written, for Fiona, who always showed up. I thought about the ranch house in Guyana and the kitchen table and the plant we repotted. I thought about what she'd said about Lee needing everyone to see her. She saw it, she saw all of it. She just couldn't protect me from it directly, so she left me what she could. The Monday meeting with Janet lasted 2 hours. She offered me a newly created role, VP of Strategic Accounts. It came with direct responsibility for our Tier 1 clients, a seat at the leadership table, and a salary that was enough to make me sit very still for a moment before I said anything. Gary was placed on a performance improvement plan within the same week. I don't know exactly what Janet knew or when she knew it, but the Hargrove letter had clearly opened something she'd already been watching. I accepted the position on a Wednesday afternoon. I sat at my desk after and ate the sandwich I'd brought from home and looked out the window at the parking lot, and thought that this was exactly what it felt like when things went right without you having to make them loud about it. I haven't spoken to Lee since the gala. She texted me twice, once to say she heard I got a promotion and to offer congratulations that felt like sandpaper, and once to ask if I was coming to our parents' 4th of July cookout. I said I wasn't sure about the cookout. I haven't responded to the congratulations text yet. My mom called to say Lee mentioned there'd been some tension at the gala. I said I wasn't aware of any tension. My mom said she hoped we weren't going to make things difficult. I said I hoped so too. That was the whole conversation. I don't know what Lee told them. I don't know what version of that night she's living in. I do know that she looked at me across a dinner table once and said I was the one they had to carry, and I know she meant it, and I know that I spent 31 years believing it was probably true. Some part of me, even when I was fixing the thing no one else could fix, even when Walter Chu was calling my cell at 6 in the morning because I was the person worth calling. Some part of me carried her voice around like a tax I'd never finished paying. I'm putting it down. That's the only way I know how to say it. I'm putting it down. Raymond Stokes sent me a handwritten note after the gala. It said that Walter had wanted him to attend personally, because Walter felt that too often, the people who actually do the work don't get to be in the room when it matters. He said Walter was looking forward to the contract renewal conversation in the fall. I have that note on my desk, not framed or anything, just there, folded in thirds, like a regular piece of mail. Vera used to say the best gift is knowing how to do the work without needing a crowd to watch you do it. I thought for a long time that was just something she said because she was kind. I think now it was something she said because she knew what was coming for me and she wanted me to have the right thing in my hands before it arrived. She left me $60,000, and she left me that. I think the second one was worth more. I've thought a lot about what made that night at the Hilton turn out the way it did. Not the envelope, not Raymond showing up, not Janet's letter. The thing underneath all of that. What actually caused it. And what I keep coming back to is this: I showed up. For years, I just showed up. For years, I just showed up. Not because anyone was watching. Not because I thought it would lead somewhere. I drove to Vera's house on Tuesday nights when I was exhausted because she needed someone there. I called Walter at 6 in the morning during the worst 3 weeks of that freight crisis because the account needed someone accountable. I did the work when the work wasn't glamorous and when nobody was writing emails about it and when the credit was going somewhere else entirely. I did it because it needed doing and I was the person who could do it. That's not a virtue I was born with. I think I learned it from watching what the alternative looks like. Lee spent her whole life making sure people saw her doing things. She was very good at being in the right room. She was very good at attaching herself to outcomes she hadn't produced and making that attachment feel natural, even inevitable. And for a long time it worked. It worked on our parents. It worked on our parents. It almost worked on me that night, with the folder sitting on the table and the notary somewhere in the building and my whole professional life about 2 signatures away from being quietly handed to someone else. What stopped it wasn't luck. It was that I had done the actual work long enough that there was a record. Walter's files had my name in them hundreds of times. The communication logs, the service recovery timeline Raymond had put together. All of that existed because I had been the one actually doing the thing every time for 3 years. You can't forge that retroactively. Lee and Gary could rearrange paperwork. They couldn't rearrange what had actually happened. I think about that a lot when I feel the pull to cut corners, or to let someone else take a problem because it's not technically mine, or to protect my own energy at the expense of the person who needs something done. Every time I do the real work, I'm building something. Not a reputation, exactly. Something more internal than that. A record of who I actually am, written in what I've actually done. That record doesn't lie. And eventually, when it matters, it speaks. Leigh isn't a villain in the way stories need villains to be. She's just a person who decided very early that being seen mattered more than being real. And that decision compounded over time, the way decisions do, until she was sitting across from her own sister at a work event, trying to help someone take what her sister had earned. That's not a monster. That's just what happens when you build a life on surfaces. The surfaces eventually don't hold. I'm not angry at her. I'm mostly just sad and a little relieved and very clear now about what I want my own life to be built on. I want it built on the Tuesday nights, on the 6 a.m. calls, on the work that doesn't have an audience. That's the only foundation I've ever seen that actually holds. Vera knew that. She left me a note that said for Fiona, who always showed up. At the time, I thought it was just something kind she wrote because she loved me. Now I think she was telling me exactly what she'd seen and exactly what she wanted me to keep doing. She was right. I'm going to keep doing it.